The crystal chandeliers of Chicago's Astoria Grand Concert Hall glittered, casting a brilliant light on the polished lid of the Fazioli grand piano. Down below, on the plush red carpets and between the gold-trimmed walls, the city's elite were finding their seats. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and anticipation. This was the night of Elliot Greaves, a living legend, and every ticket had been sold out for months. At the center of all this splendor was a woman nobody saw. Her name was Clara Jensen, 34 years old. Her name tag simply read, Logistics Staff. She was using a soft cloth to gently wipe the last specks of dust from the $200,000 instrument. Her hands were rough with calluses on the palms and slightly swollen knuckles. They were the hands of a woman who'd spent the last decade cleaning, hauling, and doing all the silent work that allowed nights like this to happen. No one in that concert hall knew that these same hands once danced across piano keys. They had practiced for thousands of hours, from simple Mozart sonatas to complex Liszt etudes. They had belonged to a little girl who dreamed of being a concert pianist, encouraged every day by her carpenter father. But life has a cruel way of taking detours. Poverty, family obligations, and a series of slammed doors had turned that dream into a distant memory, a dull ache she buried deep inside. Now the hands that dreamed of making music were used only to hold dustcloths and trays of water for the artists. The dressing room door swung open. Elliot Greaves, 54, emerged. He was tall, his salt and pepper hair perfectly coiffed, his tuxedo tailored to perfection. He walked with the easy confidence of a king in his own kingdom. Heads turned, and whispers of admiration followed him. Elliot nodded at a few wealthy sponsors, his smile polite but distant. He walked right past Clara, as if she were part of the furniture, a nameless shadow in his brilliant world. To him, she, and people like her, simply existed to serve. They were the invisible cogs in the machine of his greatness. Clara lowered her head and stepped back into the shadows of the wings used to being invisible. It started as a cruel little game, born from a moment of Clara's weakness. The show was 15 minutes away. The audience was nearly full. Elliot Greaves sat at the piano, playing a few random scales and arpeggios to warm up his fingers. It was a passage from Chopin's Ballade No. 1, the notes flowing with a technical perfection that was almost cold. Hiding in the wings, Clara couldn't look away. She wasn't watching Elliot, she was watching his hands move across the keys. Unconsciously, her own fingers twitched in the air, a ghost of muscle memory she had long forgotten. She was lost in the music, forgetting where she was, who she was. A look of pure, raw longing was on her face, a passion she thought she had buried long ago. And then Elliot stopped. He had caught her gaze. The sudden silence snapped Clara back to reality. She flinched, looking down in embarrassment, but it was too late. A mocking smile played on Elliot's lips. He loved moments like this, little opportunities to assert his superiority. Like what you hear? He asked, his voice loud enough for the first few rows to hear. Care to give it a try? Clara froze, her face burning with shame. She stammered, "No, sir, I'm sorry, but..." Elliot wouldn't let it go. He stood up and made a dramatic, inviting gesture toward the piano. "I insist. Come on. Show everyone your hidden talents," he said, dripping sarcasm on the word talents. "Or do you only know how to dust it?" A stir went through the hall. Little snickers and giggles rippled through the crowd. Hundreds of powerful, wealthy eyes were now fixed on the small logistics worker. It was a public trap, a perfectly staged humiliation. Elliot stood there, arms crossed, the smug look of a predator toying with its prey. He was turning her into a joke, for the amusement of his elite fans. Clara felt her throat close up. Tears welled in her eyes. She wanted to turn and run, to disappear, back into the darkness where she belonged. But then a voice echoed in her mind, the warm, steady voice of her father, a poor piano tuner from the south side of Chicago. He had been gone for 10 years, but his words were as clear as day. "You weren't born to wipe down this piano, Clara," he had once told her when she was a frustrated 10-year-old struggling with a difficult piece. "You were born to make it sing." Those words shot through her like an electric current. The fear vanished, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She lifted her chin and looked Elliot straight in the eye. She stepped out of the shadows and walked toward the piano. The entire hall fell silent, expecting a disaster. She placed her rough fingers on the cool ivory keys. They looked so out of place on the perfect surface of the Fazioli. Elliot Greaves stood a few feet away, that smirk still on his face, waiting for the first clumsy mistake, the first jarring chord, the pathetic embarrassment. He already had a witty remark prepared to end the pitiful display. The audience, too, leaned forward with a kind of cruel curiosity. Clara took a deep breath. She didn't choose a simple, easy piece. She didn't pick a familiar tune to please the crowd. She chose the very piece Elliot had just been playing, Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It was a ridiculously bold choice, an act of quiet defiance. The piece was a mountain for any professional pianist, demanding both supreme technical skill and profound emotional depth. For an amateur, it was artistic suicide. Elliot raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. This was the height of foolishness, he thought. And then the first note rang out. It wasn't jarring or out of tune. It filled the vast concert hall with stunning clarity and power. The entire room seemed to hold its breath at once. A hush fell over them, but this time it wasn't the silence of anticipation, but of utter shock. The note wasn't wrong. It was terrifyingly right. Clara began to play. The music poured from her fingertips. It didn't have Elliot's polished machine-like perfection. Instead, it was real. There was a slight hesitation in the complex transitions, a raw edge to the powerful chords. But it was these very imperfections that made the music more honest than anything the audience had ever heard. Her music had pain in it, struggle-crushed hope, and a quiet, unbreakable resilience. It was the story of her life told not in words, but in sound. The smirk on Elliot's face froze. This wasn't funny anymore. His smugness was being eroded with every note. He began to feel annoyed, then confused, and then a rising sense of disbelief. This wasn't the playing of a janitor. This was the playing of a true artist. Meanwhile, the audience's attitude had completely shifted. They were no longer leaning back comfortably in their seats. They were leaning forward, captivated by the raw, emotional torrent of the music. The whispers had died. No one dared to cough. No one dared to move. They were witnessing something extraordinary. The woman who had been invisible was now the center of the universe. Under the stage lights, Clara was no longer a logistics worker. She was a storyteller, and the piano was her voice. She played with her eyes closed, lost in a world she had been forced to leave behind for so long. She played with the hands that had once washed dishes in a suburban diner, that had scrubbed toilets at a bus station and pushed stock carts in a noisy warehouse. But in the music, those hands were wings. They soared over the fast, powerful passages and glided gently down into the soft, melancholic notes. The high notes were like unshed tears, held back for years. The deep, resonant passages were like the heavy sighs of a hard-lived life. Chopin's Ballade in her hands was no longer a classical showpiece. It was a painful and beautiful confession. It spoke of broken dreams, of loss, of trampled dignity, and of a spark that never quite went out. The television camera, which had been fixed on the stage, began a slow pan across the audience. The lens caught a major sponsor, a famously stoic tech billionaire, quietly wiping a tear from his cheek. Nearby, an old-money Chicago socialite, a woman who always maintained a look of perfect composure, gripped her husband's hand, her own trembling with emotion. The faces that once held smirks of ridicule were now filled with awe, shame, and above all, reverence. Elliot Greaves stood frozen in the wings. His eyes were locked on Clara, his expression shifting from mockery to shock, and finally to a horrifying realization. He wasn't just hearing a piece of music, he was witnessing the truth. His music was a skyscraper of glass and steel, perfect, cold, and impressive. Her music was a simple, wooden house, perhaps flawed, but it was warm. It had a soul, and it was filled with love. And he knew with a certainty that twisted his gut that he was losing. He wasn't losing a technical competition. He was losing to something he'd long forgotten: authenticity. And he knew that everyone in the room knew it too. Elliot Greaves was used to applause. He had stood on stages and received hundreds, thousands of ovations in his career. They were the air he breathed, the validation of his talent and status. But as Clara's final note faded into the air, what he received was something else entirely: silence. It wasn't the silence of indifference. It was a stunned, heavy silence, a moment so thick with emotion that no one dared break it. The entire hall was mesmerized, still lost in the world Clara had just created. They needed a moment to come back to reality, to process what they had just witnessed. After a second that stretched into an eternity, the first clap sounded. It didn't come from a music critic or a devoted fan. It came from the very man Elliot had once privately dismissed as a rich but foolish sponsor. That single clap was a signal. And then the room erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was a storm of sound. People leaped to their feet, their clapping thunderous and sustained. Cries of bravo echoed through the hall. They weren't applauding a technical performance. They were applauding a soul. They were applauding her courage, her truth, and perhaps the forgotten dreams within themselves. Clara opened her eyes, looking dazed. She saw the sea of people standing for her, and for the first time that night, tears began to stream down her face. Elliot, who had been the master of this stage, now felt small and out of place. His face was pale. He knew he had to do something. With heavy steps, he walked back onto the stage toward Clara. The room fell silent again, waiting. He stood before her, the woman he had publicly humiliated just 15 minutes earlier. He couldn't meet her eyes. His voice was a whisper, but the microphone caught every word. I was wrong. Clara looked at him, not with triumph, but with a quiet grace. She said a simple sentence, but it shattered Elliot's entire worldview. Music doesn't see status, sir. It only sees those who are willing to listen and those who are not. In that moment, Elliot Greaves, the legendary pianist, learned the most humbling and most necessary lesson of his life. What happened next? No one expected. Not the stunned audience, not the bewildered organizers, and certainly not Clara. Elliot Greaves, in this moment of profound humility, did something unprecedented. He turned to the audience, but his eyes were on Clara. The second half of the program, he began, his voice still shaking. I want her to play it. The hall went silent once again. The offer was too shocking, too insane. To hand over a Legends concert to a logistics worker, it was unthinkable. Clara immediately shook her head. No, I can't. she whispered. "I did what you asked. Please just let me go." She hadn't done this for fame. She had done it to protect her dignity and her father's memory. "Please," Elliot said, and this time the word held no mockery. It held a genuine, desperate plea. "They aren't here to listen to me anymore. They're here to listen to you." He turned to the audience as if for confirmation. And he got it. Someone in the front row shouted, "Please." And in a heartbeat, the entire hall was chanting it. "Please, please, please." The sound washed over Clara. It wasn't the sound of ridicule anymore. It was a plea, an affirmation. She looked out at the faces in the crowd, strangers who suddenly felt like allies. They didn't just want to hear music. They wanted to see her story continue. They wanted to see their underdog hero win. She took a deep breath and gave a small, firm nod. A look of relief and gratitude crossed Elliot's face. He took a step back, but instead of leaving the stage, he walked around to the side of the piano bench. He bent down and picked up the sheet music Clara had unknowingly dropped. He placed it on the stand. And then the unbelievable happened. As Clara began to play the next piece, Elliot Greaves, the world-renowned maestro, stood there quietly and respectfully serving as her page-turner. The ultimate reversal of roles was complete. The king had willingly become a servant. The master of the stage had become the most honored guest. And the invisible woman was finally completely ready to be seen. 6 months later, it was another winter night, the biting Chicago wind whipping at the thick coats of the people filing into the Astoria Grand Concert Hall. The hall was just as magnificent, the chandeliers just as bright. But something had changed. On the giant marquee outside, lit up in bright neon letters, was a different name. An evening at the piano. Clara Jensen. Underneath, in smaller letters, special guest artist. Clara was no longer a logistics worker. That fateful night had changed everything. Her story had gone viral, spreading across America like wildfire. It went from a small article in the Chicago Tribune to the front page of the New York Times to features on morning talk shows. The story of the piano janitor has touched millions of hearts. She had received offers from the most prestigious music academies, including Juilliard. Record labels were fighting to sign her. But Clara remained humble. She only accepted a few special performance invitations, and tonight was one of them. And Elliot Greaves, he hadn't vanished from the music world. In fact, he was more present than ever, but not as an arrogant performer. The lesson of that night had fundamentally changed him. He had used his wealth and fame to establish a new organization, the Clara Jensen Foundation. Its mission was to find and fund musical talents buried by circumstance, people with the gift, but not the opportunity. He became a scout for other Clara Jensens across the country. Tonight, Elliot was in the audience. He sat in the 10th row, not in the VIP section, but among the regular concert goers. He wasn't there as a legend, but as a fan and as a supporter. The people who came tonight were no longer a crowd looking for drama. They were there to hear the truth told through the music of a woman who had proven that a person's value isn't in their title or their clothes, but in the contents of their heart. They were there to be inspired, and they would not be disappointed. An old piece, a new feeling, a world healed by sound. For her final piece, Clara addressed the audience. This last piece, she said, her voice calm and warm. "I want to dedicate to my first teacher, my father. He was a piano tuner. He didn't have much money, but he gave me the greatest gift of all, the love of music." She began to play. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Op. 9, No. 2. A familiar, gentle piece, but through Clara's fingers, it took on a new meaning. It was the song her father used to play for her every night before bed, on their old battered piano in their small apartment. The notes filled the air not with the struggle of the ballade, but with peace, gratitude, and love. The melody was like a lullaby, embracing the entire hall in its tenderness. It told the story of difficult but happy times of a father who did everything he could so his daughter could touch her dream, even if just for a moment. Tears began to fall on the faces of many in the audience. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a beautiful, pure emotion. They thought of their own parents, their own dreams of what truly matters in life. In the 10th row, Elliot Greaves was also crying. But these were not the bitter tears he had shed 6 months ago. He wasn't crying from defeat or shame or a bruised ego. He was crying because he finally understood. He understood that music wasn't a competition of skill or a vehicle for admiration. Music was the connection. It was a way for one soul to speak to another across all barriers of status and circumstance. As the final note faded away, Clara placed a hand on her heart and bowed to the audience. The applause erupted once more, but this time it was warm, filled with love. And amidst the thunderous, unending applause, a final thought echoed in Clara's mind, the true message of her story. I didn't come here to beat anyone. I came here to remember why I started dreaming in the first place. And in that moment, her dream was not only resurrected, it was soaring higher than ever before. The story of Clara and Elliot doesn't just end at a historic concert in Astoria. It's a journey of healing and awakening for everyone who witnessed it. Clara didn't just reclaim her dream. She became a beacon for other hidden talents. Elliot, the arrogant king, found his redemption in lifting others up, realizing that the greatest legacy isn't applause, but the opportunities you create. The greatest lesson this story leaves us with is both simple and profound. Our true value isn't measured by our job title, our bank account, or the world's approval. It's measured by the most honest music we dare to play for the world, by our ability to use our own scars and experiences to touch the hearts of others. Clara won not because she was technically a better pianist than Elliot, but because her music had truth, the truth of a life that was lived, that had hurt, and that had hoped. Every one of us has felt invisible at times, judged by our appearance or our temporary job. Inside each of us, there might be an artist, a writer, an inventor, a Clara waiting to be heard. The question is, are we brave enough to put our hands on the keys of our own lives despite the skeptical looks or mocking voices? At Toch Story, we believe in the power of stories just like this one. Stories that explore the real value of a person, that celebrate quiet heroes, and that remind us of the moving power of a second chance. If the story of the woman at the grand piano moved you, it's just one of many emotional journeys we want to share. Subscribe to Toch Story today so you don't miss a single one. Because sometimes one story can change the way you see everything.